Once upon a time, there was a young girl named Precious. Precious is determined to pass her final exams, despite facing cruelty from her wicked stepmother, Madame Lucy. Every day, Precious stays late at school to study, fearing failure. But her stepmother, a woman filled with bitterness, sees it as an act of rebellion. One fateful evening, when Precious arrives home later than usual, Madame Lucy loses control. In a horrifying act of punishment, she presses a hot iron against Precious' skin. Despite the unbearable pain, Precious refuses to give up on her dreams. She finds courage in her best friend, Zainab, and a kind-hearted teacher, Mr. Michael, who helps expose the abuse. The old clock on the school wall struck 7. Precious hurriedly packed her worn-out textbooks, her fingers trembling from exhaustion. The last few weeks had been relentless, endless nights of revision, whispered under her breath. She had to pass this exam. It was her only way out. The sky had darkened by the time she stepped outside. The streets were quieter now. Traders were closing shop. She broke into a run, her heart pounding, not just from fear of failing her exams, but from what awaited her at home. Madame Lucy never tolerated disobedience. As Precious approached the house, she saw the dim glow of the lantern through the window. She hesitated at the doorstep, taking a deep breath before gently pushing the door open. The moment she stepped inside, a heavy silence greeted her. Then a voice, cold and sharp. "You think you can do as you please?" Precious barely had time to respond before a hand struck her across the face. She staggered back, her books tumbling to the floor. "I asked you a question," Madame Lucy hissed, eyes burning with rage. "Where have you been?" I was at school," Precious stammered. "I'm studying for my exams. I didn't mean to come home late." Madame Lucy scoffed. "Studying? While my dinner goes unprepared? While my house stays dirty? You think you're too good for this home now?" Precious's lips quivered, but she held back her tears. Crying would only make it worse. Without another word, Madame Lucy grabbed her wrist and dragged her toward the small table where the coal iron sat, its metal plate glowing red-hot. Terror shot through Precious's veins. "Please, Mama, I won't be late again." But her cries meant nothing. The iron pressed against her delicate skin, and a searing pain tore through her arm. Precious's scream filled the tiny house, but no one came. No one ever did. She collapsed to the ground, clutching her burned arm, gasping for breath. Madame Lucy stood over her, her face twisted with wicked satisfaction. "Next time, you will listen," she said coldly, before turning away. Precious lay there, her body trembling, her vision blurred with tears. But as the pain consumed her, so did something else, a silent promise to herself. This would not break her. She would survive. She would pass her exams, and one day, she would escape. The house was still. The only sound was Precious's ragged breathing as she clutched her burned arm. Her skin throbbed, the pain like 1,000 knives stabbing into her flesh. She bit her lip to keep from crying out again. She had learned long ago that tears only fueled Madame Lucy's cruelty. The smell of scorched skin lingered in the air. Slowly, she pulled herself up, using the wooden table for support. Her legs wobbled beneath her, but she steadied herself. She knew better than to stay on the floor too long. Madame Lucy would call it laziness and find another reason to punish her. She moved toward the small kitchen, wincing as she reached for the old clay pot of water. Her fingers trembled as she poured some onto a piece of cloth, pressing it against the burn. The pain shot through her like lightning, but she gritted her teeth and bore it. She would not break. A soft knock at the window startled her. She turned sharply, her heartbeat quickening. "Precious." A whisper came from outside. She recognized the voice immediately. Zainab. Precious hesitated, before limping toward the window and pushing it open. Zainab's face appeared in the moonlight, worry etched into her delicate features. "I saw what she did," Zainab said in a hushed voice. "I heard you scream." Precious glanced behind her, making sure Madame Lucy was still in her room. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered back. Zainab's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I brought something," she said, pulling out a small bottle of ointment from her satchel. "For your arm." Precious's throat tightened. She wanted to refuse, to say she was fine, but her body betrayed her. The pain was too much. She reached through the window, taking the bottle with her good hand. "Thank you," she murmured. Zainab exhaled in relief. "You can't keep living like this, Precious. You have to tell someone." Precious stiffened. "Tell who? No one cares." "I care," Zainab whispered fiercely. "And so does Mr. Michael." At the mention of her teacher, Michael looked away. "He can't help me." "No one can." Zainab grabbed her hand. "You're not alone." Precious's eyes welled up, but she quickly blinked the tears away. She had no time for weakness. "I have to go," Zainab said. "Please, use the ointment." And Precious met her gaze. "Don't give up." With that, Zainab disappeared into the night, leaving Precious standing at the window, the cool air brushing against her face. She turned back to her tiny sleeping mat and sat down. The pain from the burns still throbbed, but a new feeling stirred within her chest. The next morning, Precious wrapped her burned arm with an old scarf and forced herself to get ready for school. Every movement hurt, but she refused to let it stop her. When she arrived, she kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with everyone. She didn't want anyone to see her pain, but Mr. Michael noticed. He was a kind man, always encouraging his students to believe in themselves. When Precious handed him her assignment, he saw the way she winced as she moved her arm. "Precious," he called gently, "stay back after class." Her heart pounded. Had he figured it out? After the lesson, the classroom emptied, leaving only Precious and Mr. Michael. He leaned against his desk, studying her with careful eyes. "What happened to your arm?" he asked. Precious swallowed hard. "Nothing, sir. I know that's not true," he interrupted softly. "You're a bright girl, Precious, and I see the strength in you. But no one should have to endure pain alone." Precious's lips trembled. She wanted to speak, to pour out everything she had been holding in, but the fear of Madame Lucy's wrath kept her silent. Mr. Michael sighed, as if understanding her hesitation. "You don't have to say anything now, but if you ever need help, I'm here." Precious nodded, gripping her books in tightly. As she walked home, for the first time in a long time, she dared to imagine a different future, a future where she was free, a future where she was safe, and no matter what it took, she was going to fight for it. Precious's arm burned with every movement, but she forced herself to endure it. She had no choice. The moment she entered the house, she found Madame Lucy waiting. The woman sat on the worn-out wooden chair, a sharp gaze piercing through Precious's fragile form. The silence was suffocating. "You're late again." Madame Lucy's voice was dangerously calm. Precious lowered her head. "The teacher. He asked me to stay back," she answered carefully, afraid to provoke her stepmother's anger. Madame Lucy's lips curled in disgust. "You think you're special now? That man, he fills your head with nonsense. He will not save you." Precious's fingers clenched the straps of her bag. "I just want to pass my exams," she whispered. Madame Lucy stood abruptly, knocking over the stool beside her. "You think education will save you from me?" she spat, stepping closer. Precious instinctively took a step back. Madame Lucy's hands twitched, as if itching to strike, but something in Precious's eyes made her hesitate. It was different this time. Precious wasn't cowering. She wasn't crying. She was standing firm. For the first time, Madame Lucy saw something she had never seen before in Precious. Defiance. "Go and finish your chores," she growled before storming into her room. Precious released a shaky breath. She had won a small battle tonight, but she knew the war was far from over. Later that night, Precious sat awake on her thin mat, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't live like this anymore. She had to get out. She thought about running away, but where would she go? The streets were dangerous, and if she got caught, Madame Lucy would make her suffer even worse. Then she remembered Mr. Michael. The next morning, she made her decision. She would tell him everything. As soon as she got to school, she hurried to the teacher's office. Mr. Michael looked up in surprise as she entered, her face pale, her eyes filled with silent pleading. "Precious? What's wrong?" She opened her mouth, but the words felt trapped in her throat. Fear clawed at her chest. If she told him, what if Madame Lucy found out? What if it got worse? Mr. Michael noticed her hesitation. "You don't have to be afraid, Precious," he said gently. "No one deserves to live in fear. If someone is hurting you, we can help." Tears burned at the back of her eyes. For so long she had carried this burden alone, but not anymore. She took a deep breath and whispered, "My stepmother. She burned me." The room fell silent. Mr. Michael's expression darkened. He leaned forward. "She did what?" Precious slowly unwrapped the scarf around her arm, revealing the raw, angry burn marks. Mr. Michael's jaw tightened. "Precious," he said firmly, "this is not right. You don't have to go back there." Tears slipped down Precious's cheeks. "But where will I go?" Mr. Michael stood up. "The school has connections to a social worker. They can help, but we must act fast." Fear gripped her. "She'll come looking for me." "And she won't find you," Mr. Michael promised. "Not this time." That afternoon, Mr. Michael took Precious to the principal's office, where a social worker named Mrs. Kane was waiting. She listened patiently as Precious hesitantly told her story. Every slap, every cruel word, every silent night filled with pain. By the time she was done, Mrs. Kane's eyes were full of sorrow. "You are so brave, Precious," she said. "We're going to make sure you are safe." Precious's heart pounded. Was this really happening? When school ended, she didn't go home. Instead, she was taken to a small shelter for girls in situations like hers. It wasn't much, but for the first time in years, Precious felt safe. She wouldn't have to wake up in fear. She wouldn't have to hide her pain. She was free. 2 days later, the police knocked on Madame Lucy's door. She opened it, irritated, only to find 2 officers standing before her. "What is this about?" she snapped. "Madam, you are under arrest for child abuse," one of them said firmly. Madame Lucy's face paled. "What?" "That girl. She's lying." The officer held up a folder. "We have medical reports and witness statements. You are coming with us." Madame Lucy screamed and fought, but it was useless. The law had finally caught up with her. And Precious? She was sitting in a classroom, her books open, her heart light. She had survived, she had fought, and she had won. Precious sat in the examination hall, her pencil steady in her hand. She read the first question and smiled. She wasn't just fighting to pass anymore. She was fighting for her future. And nothing, not pain, not fear, not even the scars on her skin, would ever stop her again. Moral lessons from Precious's story. Precious's story teaches that no matter how difficult life gets, perseverance can lead to success. She endured hardship, but never gave up on her education. Education is a tool for transformation. Precious's commitment to learning became her path to a better future, proving that knowledge can break the cycle of suffering. Kindness and friendship matter. Zainab and Mr. Michael showed that even small acts of kindness can make a big difference. Precious found strength in the support of those who cared for her. Justice prevails. Madame Lucy's punishment reinforces the idea that cruelty and abuse will eventually be exposed, and justice will be served. No wrongdoer goes unpunished forever. Hope leads to change, even in the darkest moments. Hope and determination can lead to a brighter future. Precious's success proves that no situation is permanent if one works toward change. Speaking up against abuse. Silence allows oppression to continue. Precious's decision to tell her story shows the importance of reporting abuse and seeking help when needed. Strength comes from within. Despite the pain and obstacles, Precious found strength within herself to keep going, proving that self-belief is a powerful force for overcoming hardship. Thank you for watching please leave your own comment about the story on a comment session.